Death at Blackwater Abbey, featuring Inspector Price. Chapter 1. A Storm over Blackwater. The wind howled across the barren Yorkshire moors, tugging at the bare branches of twisted trees and sending torrents of rain lashing against the gabled roof of Blackwater Abbey. Perched atop a desolate rise, the great stone manor stood like a brooding sentinel against the storm. Inside, the fires crackled, the grandfather clocks ticked solemnly, and a faint unease seemed to cling to the air like smoke. It was the evening of February 2nd, 1907, and the annual winter gathering was underway. Every year, Lord Percival Blackwater, a dignified yet reclusive nobleman of advanced years, invited a select circle of friends and acquaintances to his ancestral home for a week of conversation, brandy, and music. The Abbey, though beautiful in its own austere way, was no longer the beacon of aristocratic grandeur it had once been. Its stone walls bore the weathering of generations. The tapestries were faded, the silver slightly tarnished, and the servants fewer than in decades past. But the mystique of the place remained, and for some, that alone was reason enough to attend. This year's guests arrived in twos and threes throughout the afternoon, their motor cars struggling through the rising mud and wind-blown debris. By twilight, the household was assembled, the great hall lit with lamps and flickering candlelight. There was Lady Arabella Greystone, a famed contralto whose once renowned voice still enchanted listeners with its smoky allure, though time had crept upon her features. She arrived wrapped in furs, her eyes alert and hawk-like behind a veil. Next came Professor Alistair Rowe, a disgraced academic whose latest book had been banned for inciting rebellion. His tweed overcoat dripped rain as he shook it off in the entrance hall, murmuring dryly, "I feel as though I'm being summoned to judgment." Miss Lillian March, an American heiress with diamond earrings as large as shillings, swept in shortly after. Young, vivacious, and entirely out of place, she greeted everyone with a grin and a theatrical shiver. "This place is like something out of Wuthering Heights," she exclaimed. "Do you keep ghosts, Lord Blackwater?" Lord Blackwater, standing stoically beside the fireplace, smiled faintly. "We keep secrets, Miss March. Ghosts, I find, are far too talkative." The last guest arrived as night fully cloaked the Abbey. Count Nikolai Volkov, a Russian diplomat, or so he claimed, stepped from his automobile with gloved hands and a suitcase that bore no initials. His coat was of thick sable, his voice low and deliberate. No one knew much about the Count, save that he had once served as a cultural envoy in Vienna and had been introduced to Lord Blackwater through a mutual connection at the Foreign Office. As the storm grew in strength, dinner was served in the cavernous dining room. A long oak table stretched beneath a chandelier. The meal, roasted pheasant, buttered leeks, and a plum tart was exquisite, yet conversation remained guarded, almost brittle. Guests spoke in circles, hinting at acquaintances, past encounters, and private histories that were never fully explained. Lord Blackwater, always a man of few words, merely observed, his gaunt features lit by candlelight, his wine untouched. Later, as the guests retired to the drawing-room for port and cigars, the storm intensified. Thunder cracked like musket fire across the moor, and the windows trembled in their frames. One of the maids, a timid girl named Elsie, brought in an extra log for the hearth and whispered that she'd seen someone walking in the east garden after nightfall. "But that's impossible," said Lady Arabella. "No one in their right mind would be outside in this weather." Lord Blackwater's eyes narrowed. "And yet," he said softly, "the Abbey has many corners. Some are darker than others." The remark was left to hang in the air, unanswered. At 10:30, the guests retired to their rooms. Footsteps echoed in the stone corridors. Doors closed with muffled finality, and silence, save for the storm, descended upon Blackwater Abbey. By morning, Count Volkov was missing. His room, located on the second floor overlooking the eastern gardens, appeared untouched at first glance. The bed had been slept in. A half-filled glass of brandy sat on the nightstand. His suitcase remained beneath the dressing table, unopened. But of the man himself, there was no sign. Even more curious, his door had been locked from the inside. The maid Elsie discovered the absence when delivering the morning tea. After knocking thrice with no reply, she fetched the butler, Mr. Denham, who opened the door with a master key. What they found was puzzling. The window had been flung open to the storm. Raindrops spotted the carpet, and a small smear of something dark marred the lower sash. A silver cufflink was found beneath the window-sill, engraved with a serpent motif. Lord Blackwater, pale and stoic, stood in the room without a word as Mr. Denham summoned the rest of the household. None had seen Count Volkov that morning. No one admitted to hearing anything unusual during the night. The Abbey's front doors were bolted, and the grounds were impassable by foot. Lord Blackwater walked to his study and penned a single letter addressed to Scotland Yard. It read, "A man has vanished from within my home. The circumstances are unusual. Send someone you trust." The message was brief but decisive. The ink had barely dried when a servant was dispatched to town. And so, within 36 hours, the case would find itself in the capable, but soon sorely tested, hands of Inspector Price, a man known throughout Scotland Yard, not for flash or fury, but for his unrelenting, calm, subtle intuition and a mind like a scalpel. Chapter 2. The Arrival of Inspector Price. The train from London to York shuddered as it pulled into the station under grey skies and a ceaseless drizzle. Among its handful of passengers disembarking that afternoon was Inspector Price, wrapped in a charcoal greatcoat, his hat pulled low over his brow. He was a man in his early 40s, clean-shaven, save for a neatly trimmed moustache, and bore the quiet, unassuming air of a country solicitor rather than a detective of some renown. But beneath his composed exterior lay a keen intelligence, sharpened by years of uncovering lies in the drawing-rooms and parlours of England's most respectable households. He stepped onto the platform without fanfare, his leather case in hand, and paused briefly to glance at the letter that had summoned him. Blackwater Abbey, near Thistledale, Yorkshire. A man has vanished. The circumstances are unusual. Lord Percival Blackwater. The message was short, but Price had long ago learned that the fewer the words, the graver the matter. A motor and a liveried chauffeur, sent from the Abbey, met him just outside the station. The journey from York to the Abbey was long, the countryside rolling past in soggy greys and dull greens. Finally, as the car crested a long, barren ridge, the silhouette of Blackwater Abbey emerged through the mist. Inspector Price regarded it with calm curiosity. He'd seen such places before, houses heavy with history, saturated with pride, secrets and decay. The car stopped before the great oak doors of the Abbey. As the inspector stepped down, the door opened and Mr. Denham, the butler, appeared. "Inspector Price, welcome to Blackwater Abbey," the butler said. "His lordship awaits you in the morning room. May I take your coat?" The butler led him through long corridors, lined with ancestral paintings and marble busts, their expressions stiff and solemn as judges. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls. A grandfather clock tolled somewhere in the distance. In the morning room, Lord Blackwater stood beside a window, hands clasped behind his back. The daylight filtered weakly through the drapes, casting long shadows across the room's worn furnishings. He turned as Price entered. "Inspector, I am grateful for your swift arrival." "Lord Blackwater," Price nodded. "You mentioned a disappearance. Count Nikolai Volkov?" "Yes, a guest of mine. He vanished during the night, without sound or sign. His room was locked from within, the window open, but no footprints, no indication of flight or struggle." "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect that something does not make sense." Price seated himself in a chair opposite Lord Blackwater. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." For the next half hour, Lord Blackwater spoke with quiet clarity, relating the events of the night before, the storm, the dinner, the uneasy atmosphere, the morning discovery of the missing guest. He detailed the position of the room, The witnesses, the locked door, the open window. Price listened without interruption, committing every word to memory, his hands folded before him. "Has anything been disturbed?" he asked finally. "Nothing, save for the broken window clasp and the missing cufflink." Price stood. "I'd like to begin with Count Volkov's room." The inspector ascended the staircase, accompanied by the butler. The second-floor corridor was lined with heavy wooden doors and faded tapestries. They stopped before the Count's room. It was a modest chamber by aristocratic standards. 4-poster bed, writing desk, armoire. The bed was unmade. The half-empty brandy glass remained on the side table. On the carpet, near the window, the faintest outline of a muddy footprint, almost missed in the dusky light. He knelt, studying it. "No signs of further prints outside?" he asked. "None," said Denham. "The ground was soaked." "Yes, Inspector. If anyone had climbed out that window, they'd have sunk to the ankles." Price stepped to the window, inspecting the sill. The latch was indeed broken, recently. On the ledge, faint scratch marks suggested movement. He leaned out. Below, the eastern garden stretched into the mist, trellises and frost-bitten hedges barely visible. "Is there a servant who knew the Count personally?" "No one beyond basic duties." "And the other guests?" Denham hesitated. There was some tension. The Professor and Count Volkov had a disagreement 2 nights ago, something regarding politics. "Politics always make poor dinner companions," Price said dryly. "I will wish to speak with all the guests, one at a time. No one is to leave the premises." "Very good, sir." By late afternoon, Price had made a preliminary circuit of the Abbey, noting exits, servant access points, and unused wings. He learned that the East Tower had been closed for years, its stairs in disrepair. He catalogued the names and locations of each guest's room. He took tea alone in the library and reviewed the household staff roster. Not a single name on the list was unfamiliar to Denham, except the Count's valet, who had not accompanied him. That struck Price as odd. Why would a man as meticulously dressed and guarded as Count Volkov travel without a valet? That evening, the household gathered in the drawing-room once again, this time under the inspector's careful eye. Lady Arabella sat draped in velvet, her hands clutching a crystal pendant. Professor Rose smoked a pipe, eyes darting over the rim of his spectacles. Miss March reclined by the fire, attempting to appear unaffected, but her leg bounced slightly with nerves. Lord Blackwater sipped tea, detached and composed. Price stood near the fireplace. "I understand this has been a disturbing event," he said in a level tone, "but I must ask for your cooperation. I will interview each of you in turn. No detail is too small. No assumption is safe. Someone here may hold the key to Count Volkov's fate, whether you realise it or not." He let the words settle. "Until further notice, you will remain within the Abbey grounds. I trust no one here objects." No one spoke, and somewhere deep in the stone belly of the house, a door creaked softly on its hinges, though no one had touched it. Chapter 3. The Locked Room and the Bloody Clue. Inspector Price rose early the next morning and took a quiet walk around the perimeter of Blackwater Abbey. The fog had lifted slightly since his arrival, though the moors remained bleak and sodden under a grey, brooding sky. He paused beneath the eastern wing, the part of the house where Count Volkov had been lodged. Looking up at the second-story windows, he traced with his eyes the one that had been flung open the previous morning. He noted the absence of ivy or ledges that might assist a descent. The drop was sheer, and yet no body, no footprints, no cry in the night. Back inside, the house had begun to stir. Servants whispered in corners, and the guests emerged from their rooms with cautious expressions. Price had requested that no fires be lit in Count Volkov's room, and that the door remain locked. Only he and Denham had a key. After breakfast, with notebook in hand, he returned to the scene. Volkov's chamber was cold and untouched since yesterday. A thin layer of condensation had formed on the inside of the glass panes, and the scent of brandy still hung in the air. The window remained open an inch, letting in the moor's chill breath. He began his inspection anew, methodically. First he examined the door. There were no signs of tampering. The lock was intact. The only key in the room belonged to Volkov himself, and had been found on the writing desk. That alone confirmed what had already been suspected. The door had been locked from the inside. Price tried locking and unlocking it with the Count's key. Smooth movement, nothing forced. Next he studied the bedside table. A used handkerchief, a Russian novel, the brothers Karamazov, a brass matchbox, and the half-drunk glass of brandy. The liquid was slightly darker than usual. Price sniffed it, faintly sweet. He made a note to have it tested for any narcotic or sedative residue. Turning toward the writing desk, he found a few sheets of plain paper, a blotter, and an expensive fountain pen. No diary, no correspondence, odd for a diplomat, no calling cards, no official seal, no passport, no personal effects beyond clothing. Was Volkov truly a diplomat, or merely pretending to be? Price pulled out each drawer. Empty, save for the bottom one. There, tucked in the rear corner beneath an envelope, with no address, he found something unusual. A black notebook, small and leather-bound, with the initials NV impressed in gold leaf. He opened it. The pages were coded, rows of letters and numbers that made no immediate sense. Some entries were dated, others marked only by symbols. A triangle, a star, an X. One entry stood it in particular, February 2nd, followed by a single line in English. Tonight, the last of them. Price raised an eyebrow. Was it a note to himself? A warning? Or something more sinister? He placed the notebook in his coat pocket and turned back to the window. Outside, the garden was a blur of frostbitten hedges and mossy statues. He leaned out carefully, inspecting the sill again. Something glinted. It was a tiny silver pin, no longer than a sewing needle, caught between the window frame and the outer stone ledge. It bore a speck of something dark on its tip. Blood, perhaps, or rust. He retrieved it carefully and bagged it. Then he spotted it, a reddish smear, barely visible in the early light, along the inner curve of the window sash. He took out his magnifying lens. The stain was unmistakable. Blood. Too small for a fatal wound, but enough to suggest a struggle. Below the window, nestled half under the valance of the curtain, was another curious object. A cufflink, silver and engraved with a coiled serpent, its mate to the one found yesterday. At mid-morning, Price began his interviews. He started with Lady Arabella Greystone. She arrived in the drawing-room dressed in violet silk, her long fingers trailing a perfumed handkerchief. She spoke in elegant, clipped tones and eyed Price as if expecting to be found innocent by birthright. "Count Volkov and I spoke only briefly," she said. "He had the air of a man used to being listened to. I do not listen easily." "What was your impression of him?" Price asked. She shrugged lightly. "Smooth, polished, dangerous, perhaps. A man like that doesn't travel without a purpose. He was too cautious to be a tourist." "You dined with him. Did you notice anything unusual in his behaviour?" She paused. "Yes, he seemed tense, as if he were waiting for something or someone." "And do you believe he vanished of his own accord?" Lady Arabella's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe in vanishing, Inspector, only in hiding, or being hidden." Next, Price called Professor Alistair Rowe. He shuffled in with an armful of notes and a pipe clenched between his teeth. "You had an argument with the Count," Price began. Rowe sniffed. "Debate. He was spouting nonsense about the stability of Europe. Claimed alliances were firm. I told him he was either a fool or a liar. He smiled and said, 'Only the future will know.'" "Was he angry?" "Number, that was the most unsettling part. He was amused." "Did he say anything about his reason for being at the Abbey?" "Only that he was studying English society, which I found laughable. If that man wasn't a spy, I'll eat my lecture notes." "Did you see or hear anything the night he disappeared?" Rowe shook his head. "Just the storm." "And your room is next to his?" "It is, but I heard nothing. I sleep with earplugs." The storm rattled the windows terribly. Price made note of it. "Did you ever see him writing in a black notebook?" Rowe blinked. "Number. But he was protective of his luggage. Wouldn't let the maid touch it." The final interview that morning was with Miss Lillian March. She entered the study with a nervous smile and sat down. "I'm not used to this sort of thing, Inspector," she said. "I came to England to find adventure, not to end up in the middle of a mystery novel." Price offered a mild smile. "Did you know Count Volkov well?" Number. "Not really. He was polite, reserved, asked a lot of questions about my father's shipping business. I thought he might be interested in investing." "Did you see anything unusual the night he disappeared?" She hesitated. "Well, I did hear something. Just before midnight, I'd gone to the hallway to fetch a book I'd left in the drawing room. And I thought I saw someone walking toward the east end of the corridor. Just a glimpse, a shadow. It moved too quickly to be sure. I thought it might have been Denham, but now—" "Could it have been Count Volkov?" She frowned. "Maybe, or someone else." Price nodded, satisfied for the moment. He had blood, a coded notebook, a missing man, and a sealed room. He had guests who lied by omission, and a noble host who knew more than he admitted. But what lingered most in his mind, as he walked slowly down the corridor toward the East Tower, was the final line from Volkov's notebook. "Tonight, the last of them." Chapter 4. Secrets in the Abbey Walls. The east wing of Blackwater Abbey had always been the quietest part of the house. It was a place of long, narrow halls, where sound travelled oddly, muffled at times, then suddenly echoing, and the air carried a persistent chill, even when fires were lit. The family used it rarely now, save for placing guests there when the other rooms were full. Count Volkov had been given one such room, a decision that Inspector Price now found both curious and telling. Price stood alone at the far end of that eastern corridor, listening. Something about this wing was wrong. He moved slowly, running his fingers along the walls. The tapestries were older here, coarse wool, depicting hunting scenes and Roman ruins. Beneath them, the stone felt uneven. He paused outside Volkov's room, then turned and studied the wall directly opposite. A long stretch of bare plaster, patched in places, ran between two thin columns. There was a ripple in the wall's surface, subtle but present. Price stepped closer and tapped the stone lightly with his knuckles. Hollow. He stepped back, examining the skirting board. It was newer than the rest, barely a year old by the look of it. He took out his pocket knife and slid the tip into the join between the board and the floor. With a soft crack, a portion gave way, and behind it revealed a narrow vertical seam, a concealed door. Price pressed his weight against it. The mechanism creaked, then yielded. The hidden door opened with the sound of centuries groaning. Behind it, darkness. A narrow passageway, barely wide enough for one person, ran behind the walls, lit faintly by the glow of a high window at the far end. Price stepped inside. The stone corridor curved left, descending by a few shallow steps into a space that had clearly once been part of the Abbey's priest holes, relics from the Reformation era. At one point, the passage opened into a small chamber, no larger than a larder, with an iron ring set into the wall, once used, perhaps, for securing prisoners or contraband. But it was what lay on the floor that got his attention. A footprint, not an old one, not a dusty remnant, a fresh one. Impressed faintly in damp soot, someone had walked here recently. He knelt studying it. Small, narrow, pointed toe. Likely a woman's. Someone had used this passage, during or after the storm. He followed the corridor further. The tunnel bent again and rose, ending at another concealed door. This one was older, with a sliding latch on the inside. He lifted it carefully and pushed. It opened. He stepped out into the library. Of course, it made perfect sense. The library was at the heart of the Abbey, with multiple doors and fewer observers. A person could slip from the east wing, through the passage, and emerge here unseen. Price looked around. The room was empty, but not untouched. A section of books on the far wall had been recently disturbed. He approached, eyes narrowing. One volume, British Treaties 1885 to 1895, stuck out slightly farther than the rest. He pulled it free. Behind it, tucked between volumes, was a folded page. He opened it slowly. "Will be your end. You should never have returned to England. If you speak, you die." No signature, no date. But the writing was swift and slanted, female, if he had to guess, and the message was unmistakably threatening. Inspector Price requested an urgent meeting with Lord Blackwater. They met once again in the morning room. "You found something?" Lord Blackwater asked. "A passage, behind the walls of the east wing." Lord Blackwater blinked. "Ah, so it's still passable." "You knew it existed?" "My great-grandfather built them. In those days, one never knew when a quick escape might be necessary, but I believed them to have collapsed over time. The east wing was shuttered for decades after the fire in 72. Only reopened it recently." "Someone used it last night," Price said, "and not for escape." He laid the note on the table. Lord Blackwater's expression did not change, but he took a long breath. "I see. Count Volkov received this shortly before he vanished. I believe he was meeting someone. Possibly for a secret exchange, perhaps blackmail. But something went wrong." Blackwater closed his eyes for a moment. "Do you believe he's dead?" "I believe he's silenced." The old man was quiet. Then he opened his eyes and said, "There is something you should know, Inspector. Something I hoped to keep buried. I'm listening. Years ago, during the war in the Sudan, I served alongside a young intelligence officer. Brilliant mind, cold temperament. He vanished during a failed operation in Cairo, presumed dead. That man was Nikolai Volkov, Russian by blood, British by commission. I recognized him the moment he stepped into this house, but I said nothing. Why? Because his presence here could only mean one thing. Someone in this house has ties to his past." That afternoon, Price continued his interviews, this time with the staff. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rudge, admitted to cleaning the east wing 3 days before the guests arrived. "No one uses those passages, sir," she said, wringing her hands. "They give the maids nightmares." "The locks were untouched when you saw them?" "Yes, sir." The maid Elsie, whom Denham had sent to deliver tea the morning after the disappearance, mentioned something else. "I didn't want to say anything, sir. Thought it sounded mad." "Go on," said Price gently. "When I went up with the tray, I saw someone coming down the corridor from the east end." "Who?" "I thought it was Lady Celia. She was wearing a shawl, but when I looked again, she was gone." Lady Celia, Lord Blackwater's niece, quiet, graceful, and always a little too invisible. That night, after supper, Price sent a message requesting Lady Celia's company in the study. She arrived promptly, wearing dove-grey silk. Her hands trembled only slightly. "Inspector," she said with a soft smile, "you wish to see me?" "Yes," he replied. "Please sit." "Lady Celia, you were once engaged to a Russian attaché, were you not?" She stiffened. "That's a private matter." "I believe the man was Nikolai Volkov, then using the name Nicholas Voss." She said nothing. "I believe you recognized him, just as your uncle did. And I believe he recognized you." A long silence followed. Then barely a whisper. "I thought he was dead." "He thought you betrayed him." Her eyes glistened. "I didn't. I tried to save him. But there were people, powerful people, he crossed. I was forced to sign a statement against him. It was a lie. I was young, frightened. I never forgave myself." Price said nothing. "I saw him the night he vanished," she said finally. "He asked me to help him expose someone. He said there was danger. I told him to leave before he was silenced again. I don't know if he listened." "Did you enter the hidden passage?" She hesitated. "Yes, I knew it existed. I wanted to see if anyone else was using it. I saw no one." Price studied her face. "If you're lying, Lady Celia, the truth will surface." She stood slowly. "I have nothing more to say." Chapter 5. Shadows from the Past. The next morning brought a cold, cutting wind that rattled the Abbey's high windows and whistled through the cracks in the ancient stone walls. Inspector Price sat before the hearth, tea untouched, notebook open in his lap. His thoughts circled like crows over a battlefield. Volkov's true identity, Lady Celia's confession, the coded notebook, the footprint in the passage, and the threatening note. The Count's disappearance was not a crime of impulse. That much was clear now. It had been planned. Whether Volkov had anticipated it or not was another matter. Price needed answers. He began with the library, where he requested Lord Blackwater's private records. Ledgers, letters, and guest logs dating back 20 years. Denham brought them without question, though he could not conceal his curiosity. "Inspector, if I may ask, do you suspect someone from the household?" "I suspect everyone, Mr. Denham," Price replied, without looking up. "That is the burden of the impartial man." For hours he read, names repeated, patterns emerged, and then, in a brittle old letter addressed to Lord Blackwater from a Sir Reginald Cowan of the Foreign Office, dated April 1895, he found the line that made his breath catch. "Regarding our man in Cairo, the matter with N. Voss must be laid to rest. Officially, he is dead. Unofficially, he must remain so." Price sat back slowly. N. Voss, Volkov's alias. And now, more than a decade later, the past had clawed its way to the surface. He returned to the guests. This time, his questions were not about the night of the disappearance, but years before. Professor Rowe was first. "You served in the Sudan campaign," Price said. Rowe's eyes narrowed. "A short commission, yes. Did you ever cross paths with intelligence personnel?" "I tried not to," Rowe muttered. "They were a breed unto themselves, vultures in officers' uniforms." "Did you know an officer named Nicholas Voss?" Rowe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Only by reputation. He vanished in Cairo. Something about a dossier gone missing. I thought it a rumour." "He was here, under the name Volkov." Rowe's mouth tightened. "Then he was playing a very dangerous game. One doesn't crawl out of a grave like that for idle conversation." "And why do you think he came here?" Rowe's voice was low. "Because someone here helped put him in it." Lady Arabella was next. She did not even wait for questions. "Inspector," she said, smoothing her gloves, "you're wondering about Cairo." "You needn't. I was there in 1895, singing for the Viceroy's Winter Gala." "Did you know Nicholas Voss?" "I knew a man who watched people more than he spoke to them. A man who vanished after attending a private party where 2 people ended up dead." "Dead?" "One by poison, the other hung himself 2 days later. The story was that Voss fled, that he had stolen something, but I never believed that." "Why?" She paused. "Because I saw the fear in his eyes the night he left. That wasn't guilt, it was betrayal." "Who else from that party is still alive?" Arabella looked him squarely in the eye. "Sir Nathaniel March, Lillian's father." The next day, Price received a telegram from London. It read, "Nathaniel March under investigation for espionage. Denied links to Voss. Files classified. Volkov presumed had dossier on March's activities. Approach with caution." Price folded the paper and sighed. It was all beginning to align. Volkov had returned to unearth the truth, to finish what had been silenced in Cairo, and now the silence had returned to finish him. That evening after dinner, Price lingered in the corridor outside the drawing room. He watched the guests filter out one by one. Professor Rowe and Lady Arabella exchanged a few brittle words and retired. Lord Blackwater disappeared into the study. Only Miss Lillian March remained, absently stirring her tea. "Miss March," Price said, stepping inside, "might I trouble you for a word?" She looked up, startled, but nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Price spoke. "Your father knew Count Volkov." She stiffened. "No, he didn't." "I believe he did, and I believe that's why you're here." "I'm here because Lord Blackwater invited me." Why would a reclusive British aristocrat invite the daughter of an American shipping magnate with no clear ties to this circle? She said nothing. Because you were being watched, or perhaps used. She stood abruptly, her cup trembling in her hand. I think you should leave me alone. Price remained seated. Miss March, if your father had anything to do with what happened to Volkov in Cairo, and Volkov came here to expose it, then you, knowingly or not, are in the eye of the storm. Her voice dropped. I didn't know who he was, not until he spoke to me in the library. He said my father wasn't the man I thought, that I was being watched by someone in this house. He gave me this. She reached into her locket and removed a tiny folded slip of paper. Price took it. It was another coded message. This one bore only a date, February 5th. That was tomorrow. That night, sleep eluded Price, and he wandered the halls, the abbey silent, but never still. The wind moaned softly. The clocks ticked like a countdown. In the east wing, he paused by the hidden passage door. It was ajar. Someone had been through. He followed the trail and reached the library. No one was there, but a single book lay open on the table. British Treatise, 1895. The same book where the first message had been hidden. Inside was a fresh scrap of paper. It ends tonight, in the West Tower, midnight. Price folded the note, tucked it into his breast pocket, and turned toward the door. Midnight. Price crept silently to the West Tower, a disused part of the abbey left to dust and time. Its spiral staircase was treacherous, the lantern in his hand casting elongated shadows on the wall. At the top he found a small chamber, long abandoned. Cobwebs clung to the corners, crates and trunks lined the edges, and in the centre, a woman, Lady Celia. She turned, eyes wide. Inspector, I didn't expect. Who are you meeting? He asked quietly. She opened her mouth to speak. Then a shot, a crack like lightning, sudden and close. Lady Celia collapsed, a scream frozen on her lips. From the shadows someone fled down the stairs. Price bolted after them, pistol drawn. He caught only a glimpse, a cloak, a glove, a fleeing shadow. But it was enough. He had seen the shape before, and in that moment he knew. Chapter 6. A second disappearance. The shot echoed through the cold, hollow stairwell of the West Tower. Price returned to Lady Celia. She lay crumpled on the stone floor, her pale gown pooled like spilled milk, a dark red stain blooming at her side. He pressed his hand to the wound, a graze, shallow, just beneath the ribs. She was alive, barely conscious, her eyes fluttering as her lips moved without sound. Hold on, Price murmured, already unbuttoning his coat to create pressure. Help is coming, he shouted down the stairwell. Denham, get the doctor, now! Footsteps pounded below, shouts rang out. Servants roused from their sleep, and within minutes the abbey was alight with confusion. Guests in dressing gowns and shawls gathered in the great hall. Dr. Hargrave, a retired military physician who lived on the edge of the estate, had been summoned. He reached the tower within 10 minutes, breathless but efficient. After a brief examination, he looked up at Price. She'll live. Missed anything vital by a hair's breadth. She'll be weak and likely won't remember much at first, but she'll recover. Price exhaled sharply. Keep her under constant supervision. No one else is to see her unless I approve it. The doctor nodded, and 2 housemaids carried Lady Celia to her room on the upper floor, her face pale as moonlight, a blood-stained cloth pressed to her side. By dawn, the abbey was under lockdown. The inspector convened the household in the great hall, a vast room with cathedral windows and wood-panelled walls. The hearth blazed, but the room felt like a courtroom. He stood before them, eyes steady, notebook in hand. A second attack has taken place, he said. Lady Celia is wounded. She was lured to the West Tower by a note and shot at close range. I have no doubt the intention was to kill her. The guests exchanged looks, some shocked, some suspicious. No one will leave this house. All guests will remain in their rooms after sundown. All letters, telegrams, and communications will be monitored, and each of you will be searched today. Professor Rowe bristled. On what grounds, Inspector? We are not prisoners. You're not guests anymore, Price said coldly. You're suspects. All of you." There was silence. "I will now speak to each of you, again." First was Lady Arabella. Price found her in the music room, seated at the pianoforte, playing a sombre piece in a minor key. "You knew she'd be attacked," Price said quietly. Lady Arabella stopped mid-note. "I suspected, not the where or how, but I knew something would happen. Celia was frightened, more than she let on." "Frightened of whom?" She turned to him slowly. "You want the truth, Inspector. I think the Count forced someone's hand. He returned to blackmail one of us, or all of us, but I don't think he expected how desperate they'd become. Do you think Lady Celia knew the identity of the person who betrayed Volkov in Cairo?" Arabella gave him a long look. "I think she was the person." Next was Professor Rowe. "I was in my room," Rowe said flatly, "reading the Times and nursing a toothache." "Anyone who can confirm that?" "Number. Unless the window pane took notes." Price stared at him. "You once told me Volkov was either a fool or a liar. Which was it?" Rowe tapped his pipe against the hearthstone. "Neither. He was a man who knew too much, who trusted too little. A dangerous combination." "Would you kill to protect your past?" Rowe met his eyes. "No, Inspector, but I might lie to forget it." Price then asked to see Miss Lillian March. She was white as a sheet when she entered the study. "I don't understand. Why would someone shoot her? Lady Celia's harmless." "Because she may have known something the shooter wanted silenced." Lillian's voice trembled. "Is this still about my father?" "I believe Volkov came here to expose a betrayal, one tied to the intelligence services and a botched mission in Cairo. I believe your father's name is in Volkov's coded notebook." Lillian looked up. "You found the notebook?" "I did, but it's written in cipher." She nodded slowly. "Then perhaps I can help." Price produced the notebook from his coat. She opened it, scanning the pages with a strange mix of recognition and disbelief. "My father used something similar, a variation of the Visionaire cipher." "You can read this?" "With time, yes." Price smiled faintly. "Then let's make time." Over the next 4 hours, Lillian March decoded the entries, line by line. The process was painstaking, but it revealed the dark undercurrent running beneath the veneer of the winter gathering. Each page was a meticulous record. Names, meetings, whispers of treachery. Volkov had spent years collecting this information. Ties to the arms trade, secret allegiances, assassinations disguised as accidents. And then, near the end, Price found the note that was beginning to shape the mystery. It read, "Celia, coerced into signing the letter. Betrayal orchestrated by N. March. March paid through third party. Greystone. Cowan complicit." Lillian read it aloud, her hands trembling. "My father, and Lady Arabella." "She was the courier," Price said grimly. "Cowan was the Foreign Office link. Together, they buried Volkov, and now someone is making sure he stays buried." As twilight fell, Price paced the gallery outside the library, deep in thought. The pieces were aligning. Volkov had returned to reveal the conspiracy. He sought out those who had betrayed him. Not for revenge, but exposure. He confronted Celia and perhaps persuaded her to testify. But someone else, someone who still had much to lose, struck first. The first disappearance had been clever, the second, desperate. Price glanced down the corridor. The door to Lillian March's room stood ajar. He rushed forward. Inside, silence. The curtains blew gently in the breeze. And on the dressing table, a final note. "Too late, Inspector." Lillian March was gone. That night, Inspector Price stood alone in the east garden beneath the moon. He had started with one disappearance. Now he had two. One man vanished, one woman shot, another now gone without a trace. But he had more than he began with, a notebook of secrets, a map of betrayal, and a name, the one common link across it all. Nathaniel March. And though the man himself was not here, his shadow fell long across the abbey. "Whoever you are," Price whispered to the wind, "you've run out of places to hide." He turned back toward the abbey, its windows flickering in the darkness. Tomorrow, He would expose the truth, even if it meant luring the killer into the light. Chapter 7. The Mask Behind the Mirror. Dawn broke over Blackwater Abbey in a haze of gold and mist, but no warmth came with it. Inspector Price had not slept. He had spent the night pacing the study, assembling every fragment of the case with methodical care. The coded notebook, the hidden passage, the threatening notes, and now the second disappearance. At 10 o'clock sharp, he summoned the entire household to the drawing room. Lord Blackwater arrived first, composed but pale. Lady Arabella followed, wrapped in a fur stole despite the heat of the fire. Professor Rowe appeared shortly thereafter, cane tapping sharply on the wooden floor. The staff gathered quietly along the walls. Only Lady Celia remained in her chamber under doctor's orders, her wound slowly healing. Price stood at the fireplace, back straight, the coded notebook in one hand and a single envelope in the other. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice calm but cutting. "It has been 3 days since Count Nikolai Volkov, also known as Nicholas Voss, formerly of Her Majesty's Intelligence Service, vanished from within these walls. Since then we've had a second crime, the attempted murder of Lady Celia, and most recently, a third, the disappearance of Miss Lillian March." A sharp gasp came from the housekeeper. Professor Rowe turned white. "She is missing," Lady Arabella whispered. "Vanished," Price confirmed. "Her room was empty. A note was left behind." He held it aloft. "Too late, Inspector." The room fell silent. "But the truth," Price continued, "has been with us from the beginning. Hidden, yes, obscured, but never absent. And this morning I will reveal it." He turned slowly, letting his gaze rest on each face. This mystery began not with Volkov's disappearance, but long before, in Cairo in 1895, during a covert operation that went terribly wrong. Volkov was betrayed by those within his own network. Coerced confessions, false intelligence, the death of 2 agents, and the theft of a critical dossier implicating several influential figures in espionage. He paused. One of those figures was Nathaniel March, an American industrialist with ties to Europe's arms trade. His partner in betrayal was Lady Arabella Greystone, then a rising opera star, and a courier for the Foreign Office. Arabella stood suddenly. "This is preposterous." "Is it?" Price opened the notebook and read aloud. "Celia, coerced into signing. Betrayal orchestrated by N. March. March paid through third party. Greystone. Cowan complicit." Found in Volkov's own hand, alongside dates, locations, and ciphered correspondence from that time. He turned to Lord Blackwater. "You knew he was Volkov the moment he arrived, didn't you?" Lord Blackwater nodded slowly. "Yes, I recognised him. But I hoped this visit was for closure, not vengeance." Price gestured toward the room. "Closure was never the goal. Exposure was. Volkov had returned to reveal the truth, and someone silenced him for it." He held up a page. Lady Celia's testimony, taken in the early hours. She confirmed Volkov asked for help. He planned to leave the next morning, but that night he disappeared. His room was locked from within, but the hidden passage in the east wall allowed his killer to enter and leave undetected. Professor Rowe scoffed. "And you think we simply let him vanish?" "No," Price said coolly. "I think you panicked." He walked to the centre of the room. The killer lured Volkov to the passage under the guise of a meeting, either through forged correspondence or verbal manipulation. They attacked him there. Perhaps he was stabbed, perhaps drugged, but certainly killed. His body was removed. The storm masked the sound. The passage provided the route. The East Garden well, I believe, holds his remains. We'll know once the grounds thaw. The butler flinched. Lady Arabella trembled. But Price wasn't finished. 2 nights later, when Lady Celia began remembering, she was shot in the West Tower, where she had gone to meet someone who claimed to have evidence clearing her name. He turned to Lady Arabella. The shooter wore gloves, was seen only as a shadow, but Lady Celia recognised the scent. "Clove and jasmine. Yours." Arabella's face blanched. Volkov didn't need to kill you, Price said. He only needed you to speak, and that you could not risk. No, she snapped. You don't understand. Don't I? Price stepped closer. You carried the payment. You ensured the message reached the right hands, and now your past has returned. Volkov's return threatened not only your reputation, but your freedom. So you silenced him. You tried to kill Celia, and when Lillian began deciphering his notes, "Enough!" Arabella shrieked. You think this is justice? That a man who should have died with his secrets can return like a ghost and destroy lives? He didn't destroy them, Price said quietly. You did. She stared at him, her poise cracking. She wasn't supposed to die. Then where is she? Arabella didn't answer, but someone else did. A voice from the doorway, weak but clear. Here! All heads turned. Lillian March stood in the threshold, draped in a blanket, her hair damp, her face drawn, but alive. A collective gasp. She's lying, Lillian said. Lady Arabella locked me in the cellar below the old stables, left me with water and a threat, said I was to be found after the notebook was destroyed. Price turned to Arabella. Shall I have the stables searched? He asked softly. Lady Arabella sank into the nearest chair, shoulders trembling, as though the weight of 3 decades of guilt had finally crushed her. I only delivered the message, she whispered. I didn't plan Cairo. That was March. Cowan made me swear, but Volkov, he wouldn't let it lie. And so you killed him? She looked up. I silenced a ghost. Price stepped back. Ghosts don't kill, Lady Arabella, he said, but they do speak. Later that afternoon, Scotland Yard arrived. Lady Arabella was taken into custody. Charges of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and espionage were read. Her last glance at Blackwater Abbey was a hollow one. Lady Celia, from her room, requested to speak to no one but Lillian March. Lord Blackwater announced the end of the winter gathering. I suspect, he said with bitter irony, the tradition has run its course. Professor Rowe packed his things in silence, a shadow of regret etched into his weary face. And Inspector Price stood in the courtyard, coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the light fade from the Abbey's windows. Another case solved, another life's worth of secrets unearthed. But one question still lingered. As Denham approached with the inspector's case, he asked quietly, Do you believe it was all Arabella, sir? Price paused, then turned. No, he said, but she was the one who pulled the trigger. And the rest? Price glanced once more at the high stone towers of Blackwater Abbey. The rest, he said, are still hiding behind the mirrors. And with that, he stepped into the motor, leaving the moors behind him.